This week, a New York Times investigation has all the Jews talking about education in Hasidic Yeshiva schools, specifically about the poor secular education in subjects like English and math. So I speak with Manny Vogel, who grew up attending a Hasidic Yeshiva in New York City, about his experience and thoughts on the issue. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. This episode is sponsored by Unpacked. Picture this. Israel 2022, a crowded bus breaks down on the side of a desert highway. Who's sitting next to you, and what secret will they reveal? The newest podcast from Unpacked, Homeland, 10 Stories, 1 Israel, will keep you on the edge of your seat as each passenger's story unfolds. Meet the Russian immigrant who escaped the Soviet Union and the Jerusalem native whose family traces back over 400 years. Each week, you'll meet a new character whose story will take you for a ride, so get on the bus, grab a window seat, and settle in for Homeland, 10 Stories, 1 Israel, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this podcast or Jewfolk generally and the work that we do, support us by buying our merch. A link to the store is in the podcast notes, so go take a look, and there's also a link to donate to Jewfolk in the podcast notes if you want to give directly. We appreciate any support you can give. Also, if you want to subscribe to our weekly TC Jewfolk newsletter for all the local Minnesota Jewish news, or our new monthly podcast newsletter where you can get updates on all our podcasts, go to tcjewfolk.com and hit that subscribe button at the top of the screen. We've got some new projects in the pipeline that you won't want to miss. As of the release of this podcast, it's day 204 of Russia's war in Ukraine. If you want to donate to help Ukraine, there's a link in the podcast notes with resources to do that. Okay, on to the main focus of this episode. Just a warning, there's a fair bit of background here before getting to Manny Vogel, so if you feel you understand the background, go ahead and skip right to my conversation with Vogel at roughly the 11-minute mark of this episode. So, this past Sunday, the New York Times published an investigation 2 years in the making with more than 275 people interviewed about Hasidic Yeshiva schools in New York City. What they found is that these schools, the equivalent of private K-12 schools in the Hasidic world, have abysmal secular education. Students, by and large, aren't taught English, they aren't taught math, they don't get lessons in science and history. Just as a basic primer, although this is admittedly a little oversimplified, Hasidim or Hasidic Jews are a group of Orthodox Jews who follow a more spiritual, mystical, and song-based way of Judaism that was started by the Baal Shem Tov, a Jewish sage in Ukraine in the 1700s. They largely dress and try to maintain the Jewish way of life as it appeared in Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine from that period of time. The most well-known Hasidic Jews are the Chabad Lubavitch group, which many of us know from their welcoming emissaries located all around the world and across American college campuses. Back to New York City, many of these Hasidic Yeshiva schools function almost entirely in Yiddish, the historical Jewish language of European communities. So you've got a generation of kids growing up in the U.S. who are second or third generation Americans, many of whom can't even speak English fluently, let alone read or write in it. Instead, the vast majority of the time, kids are studying Judaism, most often by reading and analyzing the Talmud, the compilation of rabbinic law that forms the basis for modern Judaism. There are several nuances here, which I'll summarize, but you should really go read the New York Times story if you've got the time. In the podcast notes is a link to the story without a paywall, so check it out. Nuance 1. Many yeshivot technically do bring in math and English teachers, but the teachers are often other Hasidic Jews who don't actually know math or English well enough to teach it, and the schools don't take that instruction seriously. Here's a quote from the New York Times story. Only 9 schools in the state had less than 1% of students testing at a grade level in 2019, the last year for which full data was available. All of them were Hasidic boys' schools. Nuance 2. These education issues are most concentrated in the boys' schools. The schools for girls also have poor secular education, but they learn more than the boys, in part because they aren't allowed to learn the depth of Jewish books and scholarship that the boys have access to. Nuance 3. Not every yeshiva is the same, and the Hasidic community is not a monolith. In fact, there are many different Hasidic Jewish groups, and not all of them take the approach of cutting down secular education. But the education issue is very real, and the New York Times is just reporting to a much larger audience what Jews and Jewish journalists have known and already covered for years: the failure of education for Hasidic kids, which also comes bundled with physical and sexual abuse in schools that is easily covered up. In the podcast notes is a joint WNYC and New York Jewish Week investigation from 2015 about this. To be honest, though, nothing hits as hard as when the New York Times does a story and blows an issue open for its massive audience. Still, nothing about this is simple, and there are actually several issues at play here. First of all is a moral issue. Should Jewish communities be allowed to simply not give their kids a well-rounded secular education? Lack of secular education makes it incredibly difficult for yeshiva graduates to make a living in the U.S., and it shows. Some of the neighborhoods most deeply in poverty across New York State are where Hasidic Jewish communities live. For people that leave the community, they also struggle to find work and survive, with many turning to drugs and alcohol and dying of suicide. For defenders of Hasidic yeshivas, their moral issue is framed differently. Should the government and other outsiders be allowed to tell Jews how to educate their children, especially when they are studying the holy words and ways of Judaism? After experiencing the murderous oppression of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, after losing so many Jews and Jewish communities, why shouldn't Hasidic Jews be allowed to preserve their way of life on their own terms? But then we hit the legal issue. Legally, private schools in New York need to give an education to kids that is substantially equivalent to the education found in the public schools. So by not teaching secular subjects properly, Hasidic yeshiva schools are actually violating the law, which, by the way, they've been allowed to do so without consequence for years because politicians in New York City and at the state level rely on the Hasidic vote to get and keep their seats. There's also a financial issue at play. Hasidic communities don't want any oversight from the government or to meet education guidelines, yet they're happy to take taxpayer money from the government through voucher and support programs for low-income families and kids. Hasidic boys' schools have received over $1 billion in public funding over the past 4 years alone. Here's the New York Times again, quote, "Tax dollars are not supposed to go toward religious education, but public agencies pay private schools to comply with government mandates and manage social services. Hasidic boys' yeshivas, like other private schools, access dozens of such programs, collecting money that subsidizes their theological curriculum. Hasidic boys' yeshivas receive far less per pupil than public schools, and they charge tuition, but they appear to get more government funding on average than other private schools in the state, including other religious schools," the analysis found, "and the money is flowing as New York City is cutting public school budgets." End quote. And then you've got the fact that this issue of poor secular education in yeshiva schools isn't one being imposed on Hasidic communities from the outside. There's a network of current and former members of Hasidic communities who have attended or whose children attend these yeshivot, who have been pushing for years to have decent secular education. That network is almost single-handedly led by an organization called YAFED, that's YAFFED, short for Young Advocates for Fair Education, which has been fighting this fight for about a decade now. But advocates have been shut down by Hasidic leaders, vilified, targeted, and harassed. Death threats are common. And yet, YAFED isn't going to let up, and shortly after the New York Times published its investigation, a state committee approved a set of rules meant to regulate public schools like yeshivot more closely. There's a story from the New York Jewish Week in the podcast notes about it, so check that out. But the catch here is that Hasidic leaders have successfully pushed the state to stop regulation efforts in the past, and they continue to attack these new regulations. There's also a story in the podcast notes from The Forward about how mainstream Jewish organizations, like the UJA Federation of New York, have played a part in enabling yeshiva schools and their ongoing silence after the New York Times story. Which brings us to one last issue: what the role of non-Hasidic Jews can or should be in all this. Do we have the right to have an opinion about education in Hasidic schools? What can we do or say? Are we just being anti-Hasidic and anti-Semitic if we criticize the community? And that's really why I wanted to bring Manny Vogel on this episode for a conversation about yeshiva education. I connected with Vogel through the YAFED network, and he is both an advocate for better secular education and one of the people interviewed by the New York Times for their story. Vogel has a notable background in all this. He's actually from the Chabad community in Crown Heights, where he attended a yeshiva where English was spoken, but secular subjects still weren't taught. He is also a sexual abuse survivor, something that comes up briefly in our conversation. Vogel told his story about that to Newsweek a few years ago, so I've got a link to that story in the podcast notes if you want to learn more about abuse in Hasidic communities. Chaim Walder, a prominent ultra-Orthodox sexual abuser, is also brought up with links about him in the podcast notes as well. The conversation with Vogel is an attempt to get at a deeper understanding of Hasidic communities around the education issue, truthfully aimed at people and Jews who did not grow up Hasidic and who don't understand the communities, which I think includes most of my podcast audience, including myself. So I hope you find this interview enlightening and informative. This conversation has been edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. First of all, I just want to hear your reaction to the New York Times investigation. What did you think of the story?
I thought that the story was very compelling and extremely thorough. I've been to one of those yeshivas. I graduated from one of the yeshivas that they spoke about. They didn't actually name the yeshiva by name, but it was pretty accurate.
So I want to ask you about your personal story in a second, but before that, I also wanted to ask, what do you feel the story got right? What do you feel it gets maybe wrong? Or maybe was, what parts of the story may be left out that you feel we should be paying more attention to?
There have been a lot of articles written about the yeshiva system and the lack of education that happened in New York. But this article was extremely thorough. They worked on this for over 2 years. I think it was about 2 years and third or a quarter. And I think that they really did cover all the bases as far as the different, how not to put all the yeshivas into one basket. And they did a good job at differentiating the different yeshivas by the different groups of the different sects, Okay,
so now just to back up a little, can you talk about your experience growing up and going to Hasidic yeshiva? And when you see all this attention being paid right now to the yeshiva education issue, what does it make you think about in your life?
First thing is, now that I see all this being brought to national attention and legislation that's being passed in support of education and yeshivas, I feel like this should have happened like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. That way I would have benefited from it. That's my first feeling that I have. But as far as my experience, I grew up in Crown Heights. That's a predominantly Chabad community. Most Jews know of Chabad internationally for the work that they do, the outreach that they do. But in Crown Heights, it's kind of a different community as far as what you see, what the lifestyle is like. The biggest yeshiva that they have there, the most popular one and the one that has the most students, is a exclusively Jewish institute as far as like the education. They only teach Jewish studies. They don't teach any secular studies at all. Most people think of, when they hear of this article and the yeshiva issue and the lack of secular education, they think that it happens in the other Hasidic communities, but they don't realize that in Crown Heights, this is a big issue as well. So my experience was in Crown Heights was that I went to Alitera. That is the biggest yeshiva there. And again, we did speak English, so we come across as, I guess, a little presentable. But as far as education, we had zero education. No English, science, history, math, none of that. So it was just the Talmud, Chabad Hasidus, which is like the Chabad philosophy, and, the Torah, and some Mishnayos and Halacha.
Are there any particular things coming to mind for you since you read the story, or that you've been reminded of any sort of particular experiences or, new understandings you maybe have just from reprocessing all of this with the story?
Not really, because for me, I knew that this story was coming. They actually interviewed me for the article, and I've been interviewed for I've been doing a lot of advocacy work for the yeshiva education system. And I actually testified at City Hall in New York, testifying that there was a big issue that some of these yeshivas most of them are not providing any adequate secular education. Some of them are not providing any secular education at all. For me, I was excited that this article was coming out because I knew that it was going to be brought to the national attention and the politicians would be forced to do something about it. But as far as what it did for me, it really made me happy because I realized that change is actually coming. But again, I wish this would have been done earlier, and that way I would have had somewhat of a decent education, hopefully.
So can I, sort of ask you to talk about your experience, I guess, leaving the community and what the lack of secular education, sort of how that affected you on that journey? And because you said you're 28 now, right? When did you sort of step out and realize this was a barrier for you?
I took 1 year off from my yeshiva, my high school yeshiva in New York, and I went to France to another smaller Chabad yeshiva there. I remember one day at lunchtime, this is actually before lunchtime, so the way the yeshivas are, the high schools anyway, are set up is that you learn with a study partner most of the day. And you have classes about maybe once or twice a day. And then for the most part, you're in the study hall with your study partner. And my study partner then was one of our older mentors. I remember we were supposed to be studying Talmud, and I was thinking to myself, like, we're sitting here all day studying this. I mean, it's great to study, but like, this is what I was spending the bulk of my day. It was either that or Chabad philosophy. And I thought, at the time I was 18 years old or 17. And I was thinking to myself, what am I going to do in a couple of years when I graduate? I know I don't want to be a rabbi. How am I going to support myself? If I ever want to get married and have kids or just live on my own, I need to support myself either way. And I asked him about that. And I remember when I asked that to him, he was like, whoa, we're not supposed to ask these questions. Like, he was a little bit taken back, and he said, God is going to provide. What we have to do is just study Torah. We do our part and he does his part. And I was like, but that doesn't really make sense, because like, I want an answer. Like, what do you think as my mentor, what do you think I'm going to do for a living? We had this back and forth. And I remember that was the first day in yeshiva that I actually showed up to lunch late, because I was like really invested in this conversation. I just really wanted to know, what are we doing here? Why are we studying all this? So that was when the light bulb went off. And I thought that there's some great components to the community, but I realized that that was a really big red flag.
And what was the rest of that journey like? I guess what I'm asking is, what's it like trying to leave the community? Again, the podcast, I think a lot of listeners, I didn't grow up Hasidic. In Minnesota, we've got a very different sort of perception of, both the Yeshivish community, the Chabad community here. Like, what's it like? I hate to be so sort of prying, so I'm trying to be, manage the respectful line while also asking. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. So for me, I've been through a very, very long journey to where I am now. But right now, I would say I'm not really totally out of the community. I would say that I break the rules a lot. For the most part, I'm out of the community, but because I am, I kind of have a loud voice within the community. I'm pretty critical about certain things within the community. So in that sense, I didn't really leave, because most people, when they leave the community, they just go and they forget about their past. With me, I'm kind of attached to it, and I like to implement the change that I think that someone like me needed when I was in the community. So I don't even know where to start, but it's really difficult leaving an insular community like that, even though, again, as most people think of Chabad as being very accepting, and when it comes to the outreach, they're very inviting and very understanding and non-judgmental about people who come from the outside into a Chabad house. But as someone who grew up in a Chabad community, it's very difficult for them to see people raising issues about their own community and leaving. So it's kind of hard, but it's doable.
And how do you thread that line of, again, there's sort of a cognitive dissonance here of, again, the way so many of us think about Chabad, and then hearing about some of these experiences in the community. How do you thread that sort of not leaving the community entirely while still trying to sort of have a voice in it and make a change? What's the balance of, I guess, the good and the bad, and how you mediate those things?
Well, I would say that it just takes a certain level of maturity to understand where the issues lie, and how most of the people within the communities are not bad, but it's the belief. When it comes to faith is a great thing, but when you put faith above all else, it can make people do bad things, because then they're not using their logic. They're going based off their faith, and their faith, you can take your faith to an extreme. For me, I came a long way. In the beginning, I had a lot of resentment towards the community, but at this point, I've kind of come to terms with some of the beliefs that they have, but also when it comes to, for instance, like the education, I think that when people attack the education or the lack thereof within the Hasidic communities, the instinct of the community is to be like, don't attack us for our way of life. Let us do things the way we do them. And you can do things the way you want to. If you want to leave, but be quiet. Don't tell me how to run my life. What they don't understand is that educating your children and giving them a chance to succeed in life is not something that is against their faith. I mean, yeshivish, you mentioned yeshivish communities. Most of the yeshivish communities actually provide a decent secular education. Most of the modern Orthodox communities provide a decent secular education. Catholic schools provide a decent secular education. But to them, because I think that a lot of it comes from the post-Holocaust generation, thinking that they don't want anyone to disturb their way of life. They really wanted to preserve that way of life. So they became a little too insular. I think that was the primary reason that they thought that secular education was not good. Because a lot of these Hasidic yeshivas, right after the Holocaust, did provide secular education. A lot of people who are reading, I'm hearing people who read the New York Times article were in their 60s, and they're like, I went to some of those yeshivas and I was educated well. But over the years, they kind of became more insular and cut off more of the outside world. And that's where this lack of education comes from.
Did you struggle with that lack of secular education when you, I don't know if you decided to go to college, but sort of as you embarked on your sort of post-yeshiva life, how did that affect you?
When I was done yeshiva, in the Chabad community, you spend a year going on shlichus, which is the outreach. So you are sent to either, most of the students are sent to a yeshiva to be like that mentor that I mentioned to you earlier for the younger students. But some of us were sent to communities, to Chabad communities. I went to a community in Cape Town, South Africa, and I spent the year there. When I came back, I wanted to go to college, and I didn't have my high school diploma because I graduated high school plus some, because yeshiva ends at like 19 years old or 20 years old, actually. But there's no high school diploma because it's not a recognized school. So I wanted to go to college, but I had to go get my high school equivalency first. So I went to Brooklyn College. I did the adult literacy program there, which is a 6-month program that preps you for the exam, for the high school equivalency exam. And then I started college. And by the time I started college, I still couldn't tell you the months, the English months in order. I was 21 years old and I didn't know the months. So that was pretty wild. I didn't know that was like an issue because I never really had to use the months and kind of rattle them off or just, choose one. So that was interesting for me. But yeah, that's just to show you the amount how behind I was from the rest of the students. So I started college. It was, for the most part, I had a pretty decent time, as far as like, keeping up with the class. But the one area I really struggled was math. I was really behind. And there was a student who was a year older than me who we all joined Brooklyn College as part of this. It was called BC Bound. It was this group where it was designed specifically for students who got their high school equivalency and didn't actually graduate high school. So there was a girl there who didn't graduate high school either. She actually did go to high school, but she didn't get her high school equivalency. She grew up in Crown Heights as well, in the Chabad community. She actually grew up 2 blocks away from me. And we never met, but at college we met because she was a tutor for the students. She was in the same program, but she was a tutor for students who were struggling with math. So she became my tutor, and today we're married. So yeah, so I would say college was a success for me. After we got married, I had to drop out because one of us had to pay the bills, and her career was a lot more promising than mine was. I was going for political science and she was doing pre-med. So I dropped out and she continued. And college is demanding for anyone, but especially if you don't have a secular education, there are areas where you're really going to struggle. For me, I like to write, but because English is not my first language, and I only started writing when I was 20 years old and reading when I was about 15, 20 years old. it's really hard for me to read at the same speed that they expect you to. So when they give you readings in college, that was one area where I really struggled. Finishing all the readings on time, that was one big thing.
How did you get involved with, because you said you've been involved with the AFED, the organization that's sort of advocating for more secular education in yeshiva? Like how did that become a part of your life and a part of your, I guess, mission?
I'm not sure, but I don't remember. It's been a really long time. This is going back about probably 7 years, not 7, maybe 6 years ago, if I remember correctly. But I'm pretty sure I saw some of their work. And I sent them an email saying that I'm ready to volunteer and to help out because this is an issue I'm at. Because at the time I was in college and just started college, and I was like, "There's some change has to happen." So I think I reached out to them and I told them which yeshiva I went to, and I told them I'll be happy to do what I can to help educate our children.
And what's the reaction been like? Because you said if you still have connections in the community and you still sort of have a foot there, what's, I guess, the pushback been like? Have you had people agreeing with you? What's that part of it?
So I would say for the most part, I think change is coming slowly. Some people are I'm starting to hear when I'm at, Shabbos dinners or just family events, there are some voices within the community that are starting to say, wow, we are not providing adequate education to our children. But for the most part, especially back in the beginning when I started speaking up, I got a lot of pushback. I remember I did a video for Yafed. This was just really low-key video. I sat down at a table with them and there was a camera there. I was just talking about my experience within the yeshiva. I was just saying stories that happened. The response was insane. I had people calling for my death, people saying that I should be in cherem, which is a Hebrew term for, it means in isolation, that you should not be allowed, no one should be allowed to talk to you. It's a way that they used to punish people back in the day in the old shtetls in Europe and Russia. So people were saying that. Someone online, I actually know who this guy is, someone from Crown Heights, wrote that we should drown this guy in the mikveh. That's also another thing they used to do in Russia to people who would snitch. So by bringing this issue to the forefront, people were really, really attacking me.
And you brought up the sort of aspect of snitching. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of I guess, anti-government aspect of it? Because it's both sort of visible on the outside and from some of the conversations I've had personally with people, there's a very strong sense of, especially after the Holocaust, especially after the pogroms, especially after this sort of experience with oppressive government in Eastern Europe, part of the attitude for, the Hasidic community is we want no government involved at all. They'll take the money, which is sort of part of the issue, but no regulation whatsoever. Can you talk about that attitude?
That attitude has definitely started because of like I said, the post-Holocaust, or like you mentioned, the post-Holocaust generation not being, or also it's the post-Holocaust generation in the Polish Hasidic communities, which are most of the other what we call them the Polisher Hasidim, which is pretty much all Hasidim aside from Chabad. Chabad came from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, that area. So their PTSD, their trauma comes from the Soviet Russia. So they're very distrustful of government because in their minds, well, it was kind of accurate. The government was out to get them. They were suppressing their freedom of religion. So they kept that notion and that way of thinking with them when they came to America. And I would say there's a lot of generational trauma. And that's why the younger people today still maintain that attitude to an extent. But I will say that more recently, without really getting into politics, there's a really, really big shift to the right within the Hasidic communities with all the Trump rhetoric talking about some people can be anti-America. If you're anti-Trump, you're anti-America or something like that. So they've adopted that as well. They think that anything that government is involved in is out to get them. And they adopted that attitude from Trump, that the FBI is out to get Trump. The FBI must be against us all. So it's kind of the same idea. I don't mean to categorize everyone into one basket, especially when it comes to politics, but I'm just saying that this attitude is definitely very present within the Hasidic communities. But like you mentioned, when it comes to public funding, they're not shy about taking the public funding. I mean, and rightfully so, they do need it. if you look at the poorest areas in New York, if you look at the census data, New Square, which is a strictly Hasidic neighborhood, it's the Square community. Monroe in Orange County is a Satmar community. Those are the two poorest zip codes in New York. So when it comes to public funding, yes, they do need it. But the reason that they need it is because most of them are uneducated. They don't really have a means of getting a job, a decent paying job outside of the community that can help them support their families. So it just becomes a really big burden on the taxpayers, because on the one hand, we're supporting these yeshivas and we're giving them a lot of money. And then when it comes to them after they graduate, when it comes to like just cost of living, the taxpayers are paying for that as well.
And I want to sort of come back to the New York Times story a little bit and talk about what seems to be a sort of paradox where for people who support the yeshiva the way that they are, it's all about how great the tight-knit community is in some sense, with the very real culture of like tzedakah and caring for one another and looking out for one another. But at the same time, being tight-knit also makes it easier to get away with and excuse abuse, both physical and sexual, which is sort of a notable part of the New York Times story, and which is something Yafed and other people critical of the yeshiva system have been pointing out. So for people who, again, didn't sort of grow up in and don't understand the Hasidic community, can you explain maybe how you think through the conflicting aspects of that, of the sort of the good parts of being tight-knit, but also the bad aspects that enables?
So I would say when it comes to the education issue, I think it's kind of irrelevant when it comes to the education issue, because you can be a tight-knit community and still provide decent education for people. What they're really afraid of is that people will leave the faith if they're educated. That's wrong, because even if that is true, that still doesn't give you a reason to neglect their education. I mean, if we're talking about faith, there is a halacha in Judaism that you must teach your child how to swim, and you must teach them a trade. Because if you don't teach them how to swim, they can drown. If you don't teach them a trade, they can die of hunger. Well, I'm being extreme, but my point is that you need to teach them how to survive. So you can be a tight-knit community and still provide education. But then when it comes to the good of the tight-knit community, I mean, I'll be the first one to tell you there are great things about the tight-knit community. Number one, you always have someone who understands you. You walk into a room when you're in the community, everyone knows something about you, because you guys are both living the same life, both hang around the same people for the most part. Families will know each other, so it's very easy to get along with people. So that's just on a social level. Then when it comes down to like economics and things like that, I think that it's great that they really do look out for each other. They do. There's a lot of chesed, a lot of good deeds that they do between one another. If someone is ever sick, you'll see these GoFundMes pop up, and they'll raise millions of dollars for someone who's sick or someone who passed, and the family needs money. So there's a great understanding between the communities of what their needs are, because most of them are living the same lifestyle.
What about the abuse aspect? Because a large part of the New York Times story was also about, teachers hitting students and yeshivot and, getting away with it. And, there seems to be both a topic about sort of physical abuse and hitting, as well as sexual abuse, which gets covered up easily in the same context.
Absolutely. That is a really big issue. It's actually interesting. This is going back about 5 years ago. I was approached by a reporter from Newsweek, and he asked me about the education issue in Crown Heights, or in general in the Chabad community, in the Hasidic communities. And apparently, what happened was, the more he dug into this story, the more he realized that there's abuse, and there's a lot of abuse, and they enable it. So he kind of shifted his focus from the educational neglect to the abuse within the yeshiva system, and he uncovered a bombshell. He sent me a picture of his wall at work, and there was just a board full of pictures of rabbis from different yeshivas who all abused children, physically or sexual. Unfortunately, I've had that experience twice in two different yeshivas. So he when we had that conversation, he put that in the article, because there was a lot to talk about, unfortunately. But that issue, I think that when it came to the New York Times article, they didn't want to talk about it as much because it would overshadow the educational issue. Not that it's not a big issue. I'll be the first one to tell you it is, as someone who's experienced it. But when it comes to the corporal punishment, like they had to bring that up. And I've definitely seen that within the yeshiva when I was a child. But thank God I was not one of those children who was ever hit by my teachers. Again, I was sexually assaulted twice by two different people in the yeshiva systems, but never physical abuse.
If you're okay with it, for listeners, I'll put that Newsweek story into the podcast notes so they can actually go and check it out. Because that is a much longer and deeper discussion that also for sure needs to be had. Do you have any sort of worries about the New York Times story? This is kind of a weird question, but I mean that in the sense of like, I've already heard concern that with all the attacks on Hasidic and Haredi Jews in New York, and of course, general rising anti-Semitism, there's a fear that, like, while this is an important story to tell, with the New York Times telling it, this could definitely sort of spark, more attacks or some kind of backlash towards Jews in general.
I don't think so, because I think that the New York Times did a great job of being very specific at what the issues are. There was nothing that was defamatory there. There was nothing that was anti-Semitic. It was all strictly factual. I've actually brought this up to some people from my community. I said that if you're unhappy with the way it's being reported, or the fact that it's being reported nationally by a paper like the New York Times, then the community should have woken up and done something about it. Hasidic communities that are so insular don't like when there's an outside light shine on them, because they feel like it attacks them and attacks their way of life. But when it comes to implementing change, where change really needs to happen, they're very reluctant, and their claim is, "Don't tell us what to do. We will live our life. You live your life." But again, I'm someone who grew up in that system. If I am not able to say anything about it because I should live my life, they should live theirs, then who is going to be able to say something about it? Because as soon as someone says something about it, you're shunned upon, and you're an outsider. So I guess this is what it takes for change to happen.
To ask about the media landscape, just briefly, there's every once in a while I'll see on Twitter this sort of conversation pop up of, if the Hasidic newspapers and sort of media and Ami magazine and all these other sort of publications took these issues seriously and brought them up inside of the community and shone that light inside of the community, there wouldn't be a necessity to sort of have this blown open for the rest of the world. What's the media landscape like when it comes to that in the community?
It's extremely one-dimensional. There's no voicing opposition to anything that goes on in the community. Even when it comes to sexual abuse, it took them years to actually face it. And the only reason that they faced it was because people spoke up and people brought attention to the communities because of these issues. There was even an author who was accused of, are you familiar with the story with Chaim Walder? Walder, I think his name was. He was an Israeli children's author. He wrote lots of children's books, I think adult books as well. But he was he had some title that I'm not sure if it was legit or not. But either way, he was an author, and he was very well respected within the Jewish community, the Haredi communities. And someone accused him of sexual abuse. And I think what happened was that more and more people came out and accused him, and then he committed suicide. There was a really, really big presence at his funeral. And one guy who owns a Judaica store in New York decided that he wasn't going to sell his books anymore. And he came under attack because to them, he was kind of like a social justice warrior. And there's no room for that in the community. So my point is that even as far, this happened within the last year or so. So even till today, there are issues where change needs to happen, but they're so reluctant. And anyone who brings up, so to say, who brings their dirty laundry out into the public becomes the bad person.
And talking again about the sort of public airing of the dirty laundry, what do you say to the idea that non-Jews and non-Hasidic Jews shouldn't get involved or shouldn't express their view on the story and on yeshiva education, which has been sort of a big outcry from people who support the system? And I ask you that not just because in general it's an important question about, how the rest of us as Jews feel involved in this story, but also that it's its own fine line with there being a lot of anti-Hasidic bias among non-Hasidic Jews, just to be completely blunt about that, where a lot of people very easily slip into this mindset of, oh, these people, they're all like terrible child abusers and, paint the whole community. How do you navigate that line and where do you come down on sort of where the rest of the community and sort of other people writ large can come in on this story?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I don't really know the answer because there always is trouble treading this line between constructive criticism and going overboard and generalizing a group and stereotyping a group. So it's tough, but when there's an issue as big as this educational neglect issue, Yafet has been trying for years to implement change from within the community. The first people, when the organization started, they went to the leaders of the yeshivas and they shut him down. So they went to the politicians and said, these laws are already in place. It's your duty to enforce them. So when it comes to hanging the dirty laundry in the public, they're always reluctant to implement change when you approach them directly. And then when you try to implement change externally or try to raise the issue nationally or in generally in the public, then they get upset at you for airing it out to the public. So it's kind of a lose-lose for anyone who's trying to help someone, especially when it comes to like again, the issue of, sexual abuse within the communities or educational neglect.
What would you say is the most sort of important takeaway you want people to have from the New York Times story? And the takeaway also in terms of what people can do in terms of their ability to get involved in addressing it, if that makes sense.
As far as getting involved to help, I would recommend going to Yafet's website and donating, because they're the only organization that's dedicated to helping children who are not being educated in the Hasidic communities. The most important takeaway is that no community is perfect and change is possible. That's what I think, because when you read an article like that and it's, an article as detailed as that and thorough, that there's no two ways about it, that you just look at that, you finish reading the article and you're like, wow, how do you justify something like this? So when you read something like that, it's easy, like you said, to just put all the religious Jews into one basket and be like, they're all bad. And look what they're trying to do to work around the law and trying not to follow the law. But again, I think change is possible, and we just have to understand where they're coming from. But at the same time, they do have to follow the law, because the law applies to them just like any other resident of New York State.
You keep bringing up this sort of sense of hope, which on one hand is really admirable. On the other hand, it's, as with sort of any movement that goes on for a long time, what do you see as the future of this, and how long do you think it'll take to sort of get a good secular education in yeshivas? Because at every turn, the community has sort of blocked efforts by the state to try and regulate, to try and do stuff. I know the Education Board passed a set of recommendations that are themselves sort of very watered down to what they used to be. Where does this go next when you have hope for the future? Where is that, So, yeah, I mean, when I say that I'm hopeful for the future, I am being maybe slightly a little naive and optimistic. But I think that when you bring an issue like this up so much, and people, again, like the New York Times translated the article into Yiddish. That's, I think, as far as I know, the first article they've ever translated into Yiddish, and they did a really damn good job. That makes it more accessible to people within the community. So something like that, because when they read, like you said, the Ami magazine or any other magazine, they have a lot of Yiddish magazines as well. There is none of their magazines are telling them that you should have been educated, your children should be educated, we should give, the community a chance to make a living and raise them that way. But when they read something like this, because this is all over and they're seeing it, I think that's the reason I think that change might happen, hopefully, because
from within anyway, because a lot of these people are starting to realize there is another point of view. There is an alternative to the way we're doing things now.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news, stories, or reports referenced for this episode.